Today's lesson, we're still in chapter 9, but at this point we are studying the phylum Cnidaria. This is a picture of an anemone, which is a cnidarian. And when we look at where this group falls on the evolutionary tree of life, we're really still pretty close to Porifera and still really low down here on this cladogram. We are going to continue to move through this cladogram in this direction, but right now we're still with some pretty simple organisms because these are only at the tissue level. So let's talk a little bit about their makeup. So cnidarians are radial. Sometimes we call them biradial, but radial is perfectly fine. And they're typically marine, and they're at the tissue level of organization. Cnidarians are only diploblastic, and remember that means that they have two cell layers. They have a cellular epidermis and a gastrodermis, and then an acellular mesoglia. So here's what that means. Their epidermis, or their outer layer, is made of cells. You can kind of see some of them here. And their gastrodermis, which is where they do their digestion, which is kind of towards the inside, their digestive system is made of cells as well, and you can kind of see those. But then in the middle, they have this jelly-like layer called mesoglia. Okay, remember in each group we're going to talk about something that makes them unique or special, and in this group we're talking about a particular group of cells called cnidocytes, which is also where they get their name, Cnidaria. If you have a cnidocyte, you are in this phylum. So here's a cnidocyte. This is the cell itself, and inside it has a structure called a nematocyst. And the nematocyst is on a spring, basically, and as it's triggered, it can be ejected, and a lot of times these have poison. Now, there are different kinds of nematocysts, but generally, we think of them as having a poison barb, and this, if you've ever been stung by a jellyfish, is what you've actually been stung by. So inside the cnidocyte, there is an organelle called a cnidae. There are over 30 different kinds. A lot of them are toxic. Some of them actually serve to anchor the cnidarian. Remember, some cnidarians are going to still be what we call sessile. Not all of them, but some. And some are actually sticky. An individual cnidarian can have more than 6 different types. The most common, though, is the nematocyst that you saw on the last page. These are intracellular capsules. They contain a tube that's actually used to inject a toxin, and these are used for 2 things, for prey capture and defense. When we talk about the life cycle of cnidarians, most cnidarians have a polyp stage, which is more like this. And some have a medusa stage, which is more like what you think of when you see a jellyfish. Sometimes we call this an alternation of generations, and so this should be a term familiar to you. The polyp is usually attached to a surface, and the tentacles are pointing upwards. And the medusa is generally free swimming. This is a really good life cycle diagram of some cnidaria, and you should see that it actually looks very similar to our old alternation of generation of our plants. And so in this case, we have our polyp stage where they're attached to the surface, and these will radiate and bud organisms that will then flip over. Like you see here, looks like a jellyfish, and they are free swimming. This is their sexual stage where they will produce egg and sperm. After fertilization, they go into the blastula stage. Remember, then we'll have gastrula and a free swimming planula. This is their larval stage. It will swim, settle, and then the whole process starts over again. So in the polyp stage, its job, it will actually make other polyps, and these are produced asexually. It will also produce some medusa asexually. Typically, it's from budding, like you saw in the picture before. The medusa is free swimming, so that's our motile stage. That's where we can consider these guys to be in the group of animals, and usually the tentacles are pointing downward. The medusa will reproduce sexually, and they're dioecious. So remember, that means you'll have males in one body and females in the other. Fertilization is going to occur externally, and then you're going to have planula larvae that will result from fertilization, that will settle and start all over again. Here's another life cycle. This is an obelia, and in this case, the obelia actually will still alternate between polyp and medusa, but it spends the majority of its life as a polyp. Obelia themselves are very small. The biggest they get is about 1 centimeter tall, so we're not going to see these get much bigger than 1 centimeter. But what they produce is a medusa, and this is for a short period of time. The medusa are able to swim around basically just long enough to create their egg and sperm, and then we have external fertilization that occurs. We have free swimming planula, and then they land back to the ground and start growing a new colony by budding. So the gastrovascular cavity in this group is very special. It does more than just digestion, which is what a gastrovascular cavity would normally do. But this also aids in circulation, and it's going to function as their hydrostatic skeleton. So a hydrostatic skeleton, it's an exoskeleton that maintains its form due to the pressure of the fluid that's inside the skeleton. The other thing you need to know about this group and their gastrovascular cavity is that it only has one opening. So when we're talking about something like a jellyfish, it takes its food in and its waste out the same spot. Okay, we have 5 classes that we have to discuss and that are going to be recognized. We have the class Hydrozoa. This includes mostly marine organisms in which an alternation of generations is exhibited. So we're going to see a polyp and a medusa stage usually. Most hydrozoans are colonial with specialized feeding polyps. Those are called gastrozoids, and reproductive polyps, gonozoids. So these are specialized polyps on the organism that are specific for reproduction and for feeding. There are some freshwater species within this class. There are a few examples like the obelia, the hydra. Now the hydra is special because it does lack a medusa stage, and the hydra is what we're going to have in class on Friday to have a lab with. And then we also have an organism called the Gonionemus. Now the Portuguese man o' war, which some of you may be familiar with, actually is a colonial siphonophore. So it is not a jellyfish. It's actually a subgroup here of the hydrozoans. This picture here is a picture of a medusa stage of a Gonionemus. Our next class is a newly formed class. This is called the class Staurozoa. These organisms that were actually previously classified with another group that we're going to talk about later. The medusa form is absent from all Staurozoan, which means that they only are in the polyp form their entire life. And so because of that, we had to break them out of this group of scyphozoans. Other Staurozoan characteristics include their development from benthic planula larva. Benthic basically means that it's the deepest part of the ocean. They have 8 tentacles that surround their mouth, and they have exclusively sexual reproduction, so no asexual reproduction at all. These are some pictures here of some Staurozoans attached to this rock here in the ocean. And so you can see they're in a polyp stage. Right here they're attached, and they will actually move back and forth from here to collect food. And they'll collect food here on their tentacles, which look like stars. So this is why they are called the Staurozoans. Our next class is the class Scyphozoa. This contains the true jellyfish. The members are all marine, and their dominant stage is the medusa, so they do not spend a lot of time in the polyp stage. Some jellyfish can be harmful to humans if you swim into them. Many of them, though, are plankton feeders. Jellyfish planula will actually land and develop into a polyp. That polyp stage has its own name. It's called a scyphostoma, and it will what we call strobilate to form an ephyra, which is just another name for a medusa. Now strobilate, think of a strobe light. It actually kind of bounces up and down until the medusa pops off, flips over, and begins to swim away. Now these guys have cnidocytes as well. Their cnidocysts are actually found in the epidermal layer and in the gastrodermis. And here's a picture of one jellyfish. And here's a picture of another kind of jellyfish. This one is called Aurelia, and it's one of the most common. Here's the life cycle of a jellyfish, and so we're going to start here where we have the egg and sperm come together. Once fertilized, they will have a free swimming planula. It will eventually land and form into, remember we called it a scyphostoma. Now the scyphostoma will grow more and more and more, and this top piece will bounce up and down until it finally releases. It will flip over. This is the Ephyra stage, and eventually develop into the medusa. Our next group is the class Cubozoa. Now these are sometimes called the sea wasps. They're also known as box jellies. They have kind of a cuboidal shape here at the top. They do resemble a jellyfish, but they can deliver a very, very potent, a lot of times deadly sting. Our next class is pretty big. This is the class Anthozoa, but these include some unusual cnidarians. These actually don't have a medusa stage. They consist of only polyps. So the polyps here will reproduce sexually and asexually. They can be monoecious, which means they have male and female in the same body, or dioecious, so very diverse. The anthozoan gastrovascular cavity has divisions that have a lot of cnidocytes in them. They actually possess a pharynx that's inside the mouth, so it kind of leads down to the gastrovascular cavity. And some common anthozoans, we have sea anemones, which can live solitary, or they can form clones and colonies by budding. And then we also have the corals in this group. Now, corals have a symbiotic relationship with particular kinds of algae called zooxanthellae. This actually lives inside their tissues. They provide carbon to the corals. This is why coral has color. Otherwise, they would just create the stone or the calcium carbonate, and it would be white. Now, stony corals will form some coral reefs, and corals include other groups like the sea fans, the sea pens, and organ pipe corals. This is an image of an anemone. And here is the internal structure of an anemone. So these are the separations that I was talking about. And here is the mouth, which leads through the pharynx and then finally to the gastrovascular cavity. This is an image of a coral. So this right here is the calcium carbonate skeleton that they create, but the corals themselves come out mainly at night, and you'll see the polyps come out at night and the tentacles move around, and they are filter feeding at that point. This is an image of a sea pen, and this is an image of a sea fan. This is a cladogram that shows us specifically our group here of cnidarians. So we start with the characteristic that they all have radial symmetry, planula larva, and cnidocytes. We break off, though, because our staurozoans have hollow polyp tentacles and planula that have no cilia. And then we start to get into groups that have a reduction of the polyp. So the Scyphozoa and the Cubozoa spend the majority of their life at the medusa stage. And then we have up here our hydrozoans that have a lot of different characteristics. We have a loss of mesenteries, and we also have a loss of gastrodermal nematocysts. This is an image you can find in your book on page 153. There is a wildlife alert about coral reefs. I really would like for you to read that for homework this evening and be prepared to talk about that tomorrow in class. This goes along with that. It's talking about coral bleaching